As we settle in, welcome those online. I don't see you at the moment, but I saw your names. Wonderful you can join us this morning. Let me start off underlining that we acknowledge and respect the Kwong Tongies and the 500 peoples on whose traditional territory the university stands, and the Kwong and the Sami peoples whose historical relationship with the land continues to this day. It's a great pleasure to welcoming that I have the privilege of welcoming back Peter, to the center, as a fellow and as a presenter. And Peter will also organize a workshop later in November. So, we will hear a lot from you, and you're very excited about your current research. Let me introduce Peter. Do you want to bring up this slide? So you can, I think most of you by now know Peter, so there's not much need to introduce him with great detail, but he combines the interesting disciplinary field of philosophy and economics by looking at issues of tax law and tax justice, normative dimension, monetary policies, and income inequality. So important issues of our days. And I think your workshop, maybe you can speak a little bit, just giving us a sense, what it will be about. And you can see that Peter's work has been recognized by different awards and fellowships, and probably the outstanding one is the Bessel Research Award from the Humboldt Foundation, and the nomination by the Royal Society of Canada in 2017. He has spent some time in Berlin and also lots of international work and networks. And I think that will be part of your workshop as well later on this year. But for today, we very much look forward to hearing about your own research, and also yours.
Thank you very much, Albert, for the kind introduction, for the land acknowledgement, and to the Center for having me here this term. The opportunity to work on this stuff, and you'll hear about it in a moment in depth. So the income inequality questions. So the workshop at the end of November 29th, 30th will be on capital and wealth, income inequality. So today I will talk about the intersection between monetary policy and climate change. So let me start sharing my screen. So in a nutshell, the argument of this paper is that the monetary arrangements that we have today are an obstacle in the path to net zero.
Peter, sorry, just switch on a bit more that the mic catches you, maybe just more like this.
Like that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Does that work better?
I think so. Then it picks up your voice.
Okay. If you don't hear me well online, please shout. Right? So again, the monetary arrangements that we have in our society today are an obstacle in the path to net zero. Now that might sound surprising to you, and if it sounds surprising to you, you're not the only ones, because policymakers today seem to agree on a consensus that private funding will be necessary for the green transition. And so if you look at all these entities here, the EU, the US, both in the Green Deal investment plan and by the European Commission, and the US Inflation Reduction Act, which has actually been billed as maybe the biggest climate policy piece of legislation in history, they all agree on the fact that we need to crowd in private finance to make this happen. The OECD and the IMF also have staff papers and other publications that go in the same direction. And even so, the holy grail of climate change, the IPCC, clearly sees private finance as they say, a critical enabler for accelerated climate action. So what I'll try to convince you is that this hope that is placed here in private finance is misplaced. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't think that all these measures that are taken by these entities here, I don't think they're not without intention. And I also think that we have reason to believe that they will lead to more insulated homes, they will lead to more solar panels and all that kind of good stuff. But unfortunately, that doesn't solve the problem. Right? To solve the problem, we need to lower emissions. Just pumping money into solar panels and home insulation doesn't necessarily entail that there's less funding for fossil fuel and therefore fewer emissions. So in other words, the substitution effect, and we'll come back to that later, is not necessarily happening. And so what I'll argue is that if two conditions that we currently observe in modern economies are fulfilled, then this problem occurs, right? And so I'm just going to name these two conditions now, and then we'll delve into more detail about them. So the first condition is the unconditional delegation of broad money creation to commercial banks. So that's a bit of a mouthful, and we'll see in a moment what that means, right? But it basically means that we let commercial banks create money without imposing anything. The second condition is the fact that negative externalities of greenhouse gas emissions are only partially corrected for. So again, we'll analyze that in a moment, but what I want to argue is that if those two conditions are fulfilled, then private finance is not this magical enabler for accelerated climate action, but is actually a problem, is an obstacle in the path to net zero. Okay, so let's start with the first, with monetary rate. So this one's a bit more involved. We'll spend a bit more time on that one. So most of what the older ones among us intuitively associate with money, and those coins that we have or used to have in our wallets, is actually only a small part of the money economy. It's also known as narrow money, and it only represents about 2 to 5% of money in most rich countries. By contrast, most money in the category that's called broad money takes the form of bank deposits. Now, already this term, is there an echo online? If there's an echo, please reach out. This term bank deposits, I think, already misleadingly suggests that someone has carried some money to the bank, they deposited it in the bank, and the money is now sitting there waiting for them to collect it. Now, of course.
Sorry, is your sound on your computer off?
It is off.
And
your mic.
My mic is also off.
Yeah, my no, why the
Here is much
It seems fine from our end. It seems fine. I don't have an echo.
Okay.
Well, here it's very minor, so it doesn't throw us off.
Yeah, that's true.
Well, try to, maybe I'll talk a little more quiet.
So important it needs an echo.
Okay, so it's misleading because it suggests that someone has deposited money and it's sitting there waiting. Now, of course, people do that, right? That's why it's so misleading. In fact, this happens, but most money is created in a different way. It's created out of thin air by commercial banks. Right? So if you want to get a mortgage to buy a nice house in Victoria, you go to the bank, they look at your finance profile, and then they push the button, and there's the money that's being created. Now, this raises the question of why commercial banks in our economies today have this power to create money. So the answer lies in an institutional division of labor that Robert Hockett and Saul Omarova call the finance franchise in a 2017 paper. So they point out that two questions arise for any monetary arrangement. How much credit to create and how to allocate this credit. And here's the answer that they gave. I quote, the first task, that of modulating the credit supply, is officially reserved to the franchisor, acting primarily through the central bank or monetary authority that conducts its monetary policy. The second task, that of allocating credit, is generally delegated to private franchisees, including banks and other financial institutions. So in other words, the central bank takes care of the question of the macroeconomic goals, no inflation and so on, but then we outsource, we delegate the creation of most of these deposits to commercial banks. Now, why do we do that? Usual argument that is given here is some version of the Hayekian argument that this will lead to allocated efficiency. Banks are closer to the economic agent of the economy, so they have a better sense of where it's going to do the most good. So that's what we do. So this is only a sketch of the finance franchise, but that's all that we need for our purposes here. We could also talk about the shadow banking sector, capital markets, so on, but that would complicate things too much. What I want to do here, I just want to stick to the basics and focus on two features of this finance franchise. The first is that there is no principal limit for commercial banks to create these deposits. Right? It's not like under the gold standard or under the fractional reserve banking system. Under the gold standard, you could only create money in proportion to the heap of gold that was out there. Of course, you could go dig more gold, but there was a limit. Now, there is a prudential limit to money creation, and the central bank looks after that. We want to avoid inflation. But from the perspective of the individual commercial bank, there is no limit other than the fact, okay, now, is Oliver going to pay that money back? If he's good for the money, here's the money. There's one caveat: commercial banks also have to respect what are called leverage ratios, right? So they cannot exceed a certain multiple of their equity. But if you look at the development of the equity of private banks over the last decade, that's not a really strong constraint. Okay. In the context of climate change, this means that as long as banks expect fossil fuels projects to be profitable, they will be lending money to fossil fuel projects. But I said that I want to mention two aspects of this finance franchise. Here's the second one. Suppose you walk into your local branch of like the BMO, TD, Van City, whatever, and you apply for a mortgage. Now, once the money for buying the house is in your account, it's of course true that you hold a mortgage with a private bank. But notice that BMO or whoever it might be could not have granted you the mortgage without the backing of the central bank. Now, this puts the focus on the role of the franchisor in this finance franchise. In any credit creation by private financial institutions, central banks are involved in three different ways. Now, the first two are relatively straightforward. Ask yourself why the person who you're buying the house from actually accepts the money that BMO has just created by pushing that button. They accept it because the Canadian central bank accommodates and monetizes the mortgage. It's the approval by the Canadian central bank that turns this private liability of BMO into Canadian dollars that everyone's going to accept. So that's what turns it, if you like, from Canadian Tire money into Canadian dollars. And without the backing of the central bank, all these private banks couldn't do that. So that's when we started seeing why this finance franchise picture is really apt. Just as you can't walk into a Starbucks branch and get a Starbucks coffee unless that person has a contract with the Starbucks Corporation that gives them the right to put the logo on the cup. You can't walk into any Canadian bank and get money without the central bank saying, yeah, it's okay, this is legit, these are Canadian. Right? It has to be accommodated in money. The third way in which central banks are involved is a little more technical, but I'll give you a slightly simplified version here. Just like you and I need some money in our bank account to meet our day-to-day needs, commercial banks also need some money to settle transactions between them. Now, this special money is called central bank reserves. And in order to get access to these central bank reserves, just like we need some collateral, say on a house, they also need some collateral. So there's a list of assets, could be Canadian bonds, could be corporate bonds, could be mortgage-backed securities. All these assets that they have to provide so that the central bank gives them these central bank reserves. Now, it's pretty clear that if an asset is on that list of the collateral framework, that's pretty good for the person who emits that asset, because it means there's going to be a liquid market for that. And so that's another way in which the central bank plays an important role. They structure these collateral frameworks. As we'll see in a moment, that again is relevant in the context of climate change. So in sum, any credit creation by a commercial bank that is denominated in the official currency of the country has an irreducibly public component. It's not just something that happens in the private financial sector where someone has put money in and someone has put money. It's not that. Okay, so that covers the first feature of modern economy that I announced earlier. Let's turn to the second one. The second one is a bit more straightforward, so I'll be a little quicker here. Now, what is the promise of the market mechanism? The promise of the market mechanism is an efficient allocation of resources. However, we know, this is kind of economics 101, that markets are prone to market failure. Right? You've got asymmetries of information, you've got non-private goods, agents have market power, and most relevantly, in the context of climate change, you have externalities. So when fossil fuel producers and consumers only pay the private cost of their activity, but not the social cost or externality that affects humanity at large, then we'll end up with too much of the good at too low a price. So in the diagram here, we will end up at QP rather than at Q star and P star, which internalizes that externality or social cost. Now, the consequences of these non-internalized greenhouse gas emissions are significant. Rising temperatures, extreme weather events, loss of biodiversity, and already today an estimated 5 million deaths per year due to climate change related causes. So all that is basic economics. Let's move again to two observations that are important. So in principle, we've got tools to correct this market failure. We could have a carbon tax, for instance. And if we impose the carbon tax at the right price, we would move to our efficient point of P star and Q star, right? However, in practice, carbon prices are nowhere near where they would need to be for a complete internalization of the externalities. Only about 20% of carbon emissions are even subject to a carbon tax. Those carbon taxes tend to be too low. And then they also ignore the consumption habits of the rich, who emit most, but whose demand is very inelastic because they've got so much money. Right? So you impose a tax on them, they don't change their behavior. So in sum, what we have is, and this is a phrase that I borrow from John Broome and Duncan Foley, we have a situation of incompletely corrected externalities. Right? So there's a market failure, and we don't do enough to correct for it. Now, some people object at this point, yeah, markets fail, but then we've got financial markets. Financial markets are so clever that they can correct this failure, right? So I'm just going to go on a quick digression here to suggest why I think that hope is misplaced, and then we'll get back on track in a moment. So here's why I think that financial markets fail too in this context. Right? I think we have actually at least 5 reasons to be skeptical. The first one, at least for now, fossil fuel assets are far from stranded. Right? So if you look at this is of course in part related to the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, but also the other factors. Fossil fuel stock valuations are at record highs, right? And even some kinds of assets that have traveled acting capital for a while, like coal, have found alternative ways to get money. So that's reason number one. Number two, some current and former central bankers, Mark Carney among them, or chief among them even, so Mark Carney is the former head of the Canadian Central Bank and then of the English Central Bank, and now someone who is trying to green the international financial system. So he's made it his task to point out that financial markets are actually not very good at pricing in climate change risk. Right? So part of this network for greening the financial system that he's created is to make sure that financial institutions rely on better information to price this kind of risk. Then again, we know from the financial crisis that markets have trouble assessing systemic risk, right? And if climate change risk is anything, it's systemic. Right? So that's reason number two why this is not likely to happen. 3, even if financial institutions have the capacity to price climate change risk adequately, they don't always have the incentive to do so. If you know that all your competitors are going to go down with the same risk, then why should you act on it? And number 4, central banks have actually in recent years actively encouraged commercial banks to take more risks. Right? So part of the whole quantitative easing exercise was the idea, look, we buy some not so risky assets off you so that you can invest in more risky assets and stimulate the economy. Well, fossil fuel assets are among those more risky assets. And last but not least, stranded assets presuppose a more complete correction of negative externalities that we don't have, right? And here it's interesting that this stranded asset scenario can come about in 2 ways, right? Either because the economy collapses in a very due to very rapid and severe climate change, or because we do what we saw in the previous slide that is not happening, namely we completely internalize these externalities. Right? So the first option, financial markets are not very good at pricing in systemic risks. Right? And the second option, well, they're betting on the fact that politicians are not going to get it done. Right? And they're probably right about it, unfortunately. So that's the final reason why I think that financial markets won't do a significantly better job than just any bond market about correcting market failure. Okay, so let's take stock. Where does all this leave us? Now we have these two features of modern economies, unconditional broad money creation and incompletely corrected externalities. We have them in place, and we can now see what happens when they occur at the same time. Okay? And the first thing to note here is quite a staggering observation. Private financial institutions actually keep pumping money into fossil fuels. Right? So here you've got a quote from the Banking on Climate Chaos report from this year. Fossil fuel financing from the world's 60 largest banks has reached 5.5 trillion in the 7 years since Paris Agreement. Right? Now, about half of this is bank lending. The other half is underwriting, so issuing stocks and bonds. Right? But even half of this is still a huge sum of money. That's what I'm already concerned with here. So, to give you a figure for the Canadian context, $21 billion in 2022 just for the tar sands, and 89% of that comes from Canadian banks, TD, RBC, and BMO are televisions. So, from the perspective of standard economic theory, right, this would seem at least somewhat puzzling. Because remember, at the beginning of my talk, we started out with the fact that everyone is gung-ho about pumping money into green, right? So from the perspective of standard economic theory, you would expect some kind of substitution effect. Well, we pump more into green, that means there should be less for fossil fuels. Right? But given the two features of modern economies that I've just described, we can explain this puzzle. So here's how the explanation goes. It's true that the subsidies for green technologies increase the relative attractiveness of green technologies, but they don't do anything to reduce the absolute attractiveness of fossil fuel technology. And given that finance is not inherently scarce, because there's no real hard limit to money creation under the finance franchise, as long as fossil fuel projects are deemed profitable, which they are, because the externalities are incompletely corrected for, then they will get financed. Right? To put it differently, under current monetary arrangements, the substitution effect is to a large extent suspended. Right? More money for green projects simply does not mean less money to fossil fuel projects. So that's why I think that when broad money is created through private financial institutions without any other limit than expected profitability, and these leverage ratios, but they're not a real limit, and when this occurs in the context of incompletely corrected negative externalities, then this creates actually incentives for more externalities, not for less. Right? And this is why it seems to me that private finance is more of an obstacle these days than an enabler of the green transition. And that reminds me a bit of Sisyphus. Right? So Sisyphus, there he is, putting a huge boulder up the hill, and then as soon as he gets near the top, well, the gods have created this little mechanism that he ends up all the way at the bottom, and it's going to start all over again. It's a bit like us. Here we are, we're pumping all this money into green, and we think, oh, yeah, this is going to get us there, this is great. And then we realize, no, it isn't. Fossil finance, fossil fuel financing continues pretty much unabated. Okay, so that's if you like is the diagnosis. Now, what follows from this, if this diagnosis is appropriate, how does it change how we should interpret the world and how we should act in it? Maybe I'll start by looking at some broader normative implications first, and then turn to policy reform questions. So, as to the normative implications, I think the most fundamental insight of all of this is that the standard justification of our monetary arrangements actually just evaporates. Remember what we said earlier, the reason we delegate credit allocation to private commercial banks is because we think we get an efficient allocation of resources. Now, we've just rehearsed that under climate change, we don't get an efficient allocation of resources. Markets fail to internalize social and environmental costs, and therefore significantly over-provide capital to fossil fuel projects compared to what would be efficient. Now, at this point, it's tempting to blame the commercial banks who are providing this funding. And a lot of activism actually goes in that direction. I get emails from Greenpeace. Actually, now it's a good thing they've changed tack a little bit, but I used to get emails from Greenpeace every week saying, you know, write to BMO and tell them to stop financing fossil fuels. As we've seen, the private financial institutions, they don't extend these loans on their own, right? They have the backing of the central bank. The central bank is necessarily involved through accommodation, monetization, and through the collateral frameworks. And so there's no lending to fossil fuels without public approval. So in other words, the central bank might be able to outsource credit allocation, but they can't outsource the ultimate responsibility for what's going on. And then you could go on, since the central bank is mandated by governments, and since we elect these governments, I mean, so where does the buck stop? You might just throw your hands up in the air and say, well, we get what we deserve. Right? Nonetheless, I think it does point to a significant tension between the left hand of the government, who says, well, we've got these climate targets and we've got to do everything to meet them, right? And the right hand of the government, the central bank, actually doing things that are counterproductive to achieving this goal. So I wanted to say a bit more about the central bank and the role they play here. And here it's important, I think, and also instructive to see how they themselves react to this, or would react to this kind of narrative that I've just presented. Right? So the first thing to say here is that from a strategic point of view, central bankers clearly have an incentive to ignore their responsibility. Why is that? Well, they have a status of independence. Right? They're an independent agency, and they want to preserve that independence, and therefore they would like monetary policy to be depoliticized. And what I've done is just one of the ways in which it should be politicized. They also tend to emphasize, and here I think they have a point to some extent, that their current mandates don't ask them to do anything about climate change. So that's true. If you read the central bank mandates, we just tell them to focus on certain things. So in other words, central bankers like to suggest that they have nothing to do with climate change. Right? Here's one emblematic statement along those lines by Mark Carney again. And remember, this is probably as climate friendly a central banker as you'll find. Right? This is not the conservative end of the spectrum. But even he says financial policymakers will not drive the transition to a low carbon economy. Financial policymakers do, however, have a clear interest in ensuring the financial system is resilient to any transition. Our role can be in developing the frameworks that help the market itself to adjust efficiently. So against the background of what I've said, this statement seems on the wrong track for in at least two respects. Right? So the first is that the hope in the efficiency of the market is misplaced in the present context. So under climate change, we know that markets are not efficient. But then the second is that the unconditional broad money creation by commercial banks that central banks oversee, as we've seen, actually slows down the green transition. So rather than being this agent who has little to do with climate change, I would argue that central banks are in it up to their necks. It's not true that they're not driving it. They are heavily involved. So for the central bank aficionados, I'll briefly mention just two other critiques that have been leveled against central banks that are related, but they're not the same. So one of the criticisms that has been made in the wake of QE is that central banks buy all these assets, and they have bought them according to the principle of market neutrality. So they just bought assets in proportion to the assets that are out there, which also meant that they bought a lot of fossil fuel assets. So people have said, look, this is the problem. You're basically giving these companies access to capital by doing that. And so since then, some central banks have actually recognized that, and they now have a mechanism in place. If big QE programs were to be launched again, they would be, as they call it, tilted in favor of green assets. But my argument here goes further, right? It's not just about what the central bank is buying, it's about what the commercial banks are doing. But the interesting thing is, by acknowledging this, that we should be tilting, right? I think they're opening the door to the idea that we should also be tilting what the commercial banks do. Right? So that's just the logical next step. Another line of criticism of central banks has been voiced by people who say, look, central banks have this huge power to create money. They should use it for more good. They should buy bonds, for instance, from national investment banks for green projects. Yeah, I think this is a good idea, but it brings us to the problem that we encountered at the very beginning of the talk. Just buying bonds for green projects doesn't mean that there's going to be less finance for fossil fuel projects. Right? So that logic still encounters the same conundrum. So to sum up this section on central banks, I think there are some encouraging signs that the discourse is changing, but there's still a considerable disconnect between the self-perception of central bankers as innocent bystanders to climate change and what we would need in order to do something meaningful. So for instance, I can't remember whether it was early this year or at the end of last year, Jerome Powell, the head of the Federal Reserve in the US, ended an important speech with the statement, "We are not climate policy makers." So I think this statement needs to be nuanced a little bit, right? On the one hand, he has a point in that, again, the mandate doesn't ask them to do anything about climate change. But on the other hand, in the light of the argument of this paper, it's plainly false to assert that the Fed is not a climate policy. Unfortunately, they're a climate policy maker of the wrong sort. Right? They are slowing down the green transition rather than accelerating the green transition, at least if you take into account all the activities that they oversee. So to have a chance to meet our climate targets, that arguably needs to change. What can we do in terms of policy reform? I think I have a few minutes to look at that. So recall that the monetary arrangements of a fiat money economy come with a double task. We covered that earlier. There is the question of, well, how much credit and what should be the credit? What should the credit be created for? Right. So the modulating of the credit supply and the allocation of the credit supply. So that framing that we encountered earlier in the finance franchise that actually gives us two avenues of reform, right? And they're complementary. We could either reduce the credit that is out there altogether, and if you do that in proportion, well, there'd also be less money for fossil fuel. Or within the pot of credit that there is, we could make sure that less goes to fossil fuels and more goes to other stuff, so that we actually have a substitution effect that we don't see in practice today. So I'm going to start with the first one, right? So to motivate the first one, it's useful to think of the last few decades as the decades of financialization. So financialization is a big catchphrase. What does it mean? It basically means that all these assets out there get securitized and then get used again as collateral to create more assets. And this suggests one way to reduce the credit supply is to somehow definancialize our economy. Turn back time a little bit on that process of financialization. Here's a non-comprehensive list of tools that could be used in this process, right? And what's interesting is that a lot of these tools were actually advocated by financial experts after the crisis of 2008, but very few were implemented. So here's one: you reactivate more robust reserve requirements for commercial banks. So in other words, when they lend money out, right, they have to keep more reserves in terms of central bank reserves and so on. Right? That would not only help financial stability, but it would also impose a cap on credit creation. Or you can change collateral frameworks. So for instance, on so-called repo markets, that's an interbank lending market, where one bank goes to another and says, hey, I need cash for 2 weeks. Here's a bunch of assets. You give me the cash and I'll pay you some interest. So you could change what is allowed as collateral on these interbank lending markets, which again would shrink credit overall. There's less for fossil fuels. And finally, at the extreme, this is a bit more radical, you could turn banks into the kind of entity that many people believe they are, namely mere intermediaries. So you could say, for a bank to lend out money, for me to get a loan, one of you first has to deposit that money into the bank, and then they can lend it out, which is not true today. They can just press a button and there's the money. Now that would be a radical reform because it would strip commercial banks of the right to create money. Right? So it's definitely the most radical on that first list. Right? Now, people might object to this first approach, namely the definancializing approach, that it would throttle credit access across the board. So the economy would probably take a hit, employment would take a hit. And so people would say, trade-off, we don't like that, let's do something else. Right? So I think that lends increased plausibility to the second approach that says, oh, we don't need to reduce credit, we just need to make sure that credit doesn't go to the bad stuff, but to go to the good stuff. Right? So that means adopting an active credit policy and not writing commercial banks a blank check when it comes to money creation. So we shouldn't delegate it unconditionally, come back to the title of my talk, right? Unconditional broad money creation. So again, this can be done in different ways. And again, running from more moderate to more radical. So one thing you could do is you could say, well, if a commercial bank has a certain percentage of fossil fuel lending in their portfolio, the central bank will charge higher interest if they come and want money from them. Right? So the discount window could be differentiated according to your portfolio. Or they could tell you that they won't bail you out if you hit financial trouble if you have too many fossil fuel assets. That would, I think, already be sufficient to drastically reduce fossil fuel lending. Or one could impose credit quotas. This is actually quite common in several Asian countries where the central banks work more closely with governments. So you could say, look, this is the credit quota that we want you not to exceed for fossil fuels, and this is the credit quota that we want you to meet for green, right, for instance. And finally, most effectively, but also most radically, the central bank could simply refuse to accommodate and monetize lending to fossil fuel. Right? So remember that any loan in a modern economy is not just a private transaction. There's backing by the central bank. They could just say, well, these are not Canadian dollars, these are PMO dollars. If you want to trust them, go ahead. Right? I mean, music would stop immediately. There would be no money for fossil fuels tomorrow. Right? I mean, that's maybe not what we want either, but we want a more rapid transition. Now, some people might object that this would represent an unjustified form of government intervention. Right? But I think that's based on a misunderstanding of how monetary arrangements work. Right? Remember that we already have government intervention. That there is no private money creation without central bank backing. So all I'm saying is, no, we need different government intervention. We just don't need that government intervention. Okay, so maybe two additional points, and then I'll wrap up. The first is that many central bankers will think that what I'm saying is completely crazy. They'll point out that independent central banks have no business picking winners and losers in the economy. So this is an objection that you often meet in these debates, and I think two components of that objections have to be disentangled. Right? So the first component is that in order to assess whether central banks pick winners and losers, you need a normative benchmark. Now, central bankers use the market as the normative benchmark. And compared to the market benchmark, you might come to the conclusion that they're not picking winners and losers in what they're doing right now. But as we've seen, the market benchmark is ludicrous in the context of climate change. It's not the appropriate benchmark. The appropriate benchmark is, well, can we stay within 2 degrees warming? Now, with respect to that more relevant benchmark, arguably they are already picking winners and losers. Maybe they're lending too much to fossil fuels than we can in order to stay within 2 degrees. So they are already political up to here, right? It's not they can't get out of this conundrum. I think their argument on at least on that aspect is unsound. There is another aspect, however, and that is that they are right when they say that it's problematic for an independent central bank to pick winners and losers on their own. Right? So we might have to revisit our institutional structure and see how this can be accommodated. But that's a debate for a whole other paper or book, because there are also those who say we're not going to get climate change done by democratic means. Well, here are the central banks. If you read The Ministry for the Future by Kim Stanley Robinson, that's where it actually goes in his optimistic take. Okay, last point before, because I see people getting saturated. So last point before wrapping up is a point about feasibility. Someone might come along and say, well, you're not asking for nothing here. This is a pretty demanding reform agenda. Why do you think this should be any more feasible than the more complete internalization of externalities that you told us is not happening? Right? So what's different between this and that? Right? So I only have a partial answer to that challenge, and it's the following. Everyone knows, we teach in Economics 101 that there are externalities and then we're not doing enough to internalize them, right? So that's well known. This stuff here is not as well known. You go into most economics departments and half the people won't even know how money creation works because it's not taught in economics degrees. I did an economics degree, I never heard about money creation. Right? Money is presented as this mere veil. What matters is the real economy. All this is just, it's not important. It's very important. So just bringing these things out there, I think would increase pressure on the people in the right positions to change something in a way that the talk about externalities is obviously not achieving. Might not be a satisfactory answer to the feasibility challenge, but that's all I've got for that. So conclusions. I hope to convince you that private finance is neither private, right, nor at least today an enabler of the green transition. Under these two conditions, unconditional broad money delegation to commercial banks and incompletely corrected externalities, it's actually an opposite because it creates incentives to keep funding fossil fuel projects. Right? So what does it lead to? It leads us to an imperative not just to subsidize the good stuff. And remember, that's the policy consensus today. That's what everyone is saying. And we need to enlist private finance, crowd in private finance. No, we actually need to turn off the tap for the bad stuff. Right? We need to defund fossil fuels in order to see a shift in greenhouse gas emissions. Now, one of the challenges that arises in this context is that the institution that is best placed to achieve this, namely the central banks, just don't want to acknowledge the role that they can and arguably should play in this. This also leads us to an interesting perspective on the concept of stranded assets. Right? So there's the perception of stranded assets, just the term suggests you've got this boat that in a storm hits the shore and it falls apart. So there's it's kind of an act of God or a natural catastrophe. Right? But if the argument in my paper is correct, then it's not actually some external shock that is going to strand these assets, but it's policy choices that we make or that we have to make in order to strand these assets. They're not going to strand by themselves. Right? We have to change our financial arrangements so that there's no more money or less money available for product. And by providing unconditional broad money, we're exactly doing the opposite. We're not imposing any brakes on fossil fuel financing. And I think that's irresponsible and should stop. That's where I'm going to stop. Thank you.
We're never saturated listening to you. So Amanda, you're going to monitor, or maybe you should stop the
Yes.
when there you see this. Yeah. Amanda, yeah.
John, could you keep the PowerPoint because
Okay.
but if you have questions may be related to that, I mean.
Well, you can go back in.
Yeah.
Okay, I can go back in.
Okay, so now I see here, if those online have a question, just raise your hands or start your camera. Oh, Colin, all right, do we have to up the volume now? Colin, if you want to come on in.
I think he'll be heard.
Hi, Peter, I have two related questions, and thanks very much. I always learn a lot from these presentations, and they both revolve around the role of externalities in the discussion. So, go to Carney, he says, well, look, we're not going to lead the policy on climate change because that's not our role. Our role is to facilitate movements towards efficiency, right? But the theory that he's supposed to be sympathetic to, markets are not functioning efficiently because there's all these negative externalities. So by implication, it would seem that to fully those negative externalities, people like Carney should be doing exactly what you want them to do, right? Because strictly speaking, all the fossil fuel assets, right, are massively contributing to economic inefficiency as measured by the market, right? So I wonder whether just rhetorically, in the politics of it, there's room to make the kind of move you want to make, but just say, look, you guys should be doing your job. You're not doing your job because you're not actually addressing the full range of negative externalities. But this raises to me the second question, and that's whether the conceptualization of the problem that we face is appropriately captured by a model of negative externalities, partly because the calculation of negative externalities is indebted to all kinds of things, such as the existing legally recognized property rights, which may themselves be defective and thus underplay the significance of the damage that's done to some vulnerable communities because their property rights that are being adversely affected, right, aren't sufficiently recognized. And I guess I wonder whether the focus on efficiency in this context might be a bit myopic, right? So when you said the point is to limit the increases in temperature, right? We should just be having a range of collective public policies that are expressly aimed at that. And these are just mechanisms. We shouldn't be worried too much, really, about efficiency per se, at least as economists understand it, right? But as long as we are on efficiency, then shouldn't we be genuinely concerned with efficiency? I mean, it seems to me, I think there's a good deal of dishonesty here on the part of the central bankers and others, right? They don't really care about efficiency because they're prepared knowingly to allow all kinds of inefficiencies. They're already playing favorites, right? They don't want to count the costs that are internalized by others as inefficient.
Thank you, Colin. So I just a brief comment on at least my perception of how your two questions relate, right? So I feel that the first one is kind of a piece of advice on how to make my argument maybe more strategic vis-a-vis central banks, right? But then I feel the second one, but I might be misunderstanding something here. The second one actually goes in the opposite direction. It might make it even more difficult to get central bankers to accept. And here's, so let me just say why I think that is the case, and then maybe you can come back. So the first one I think plays on a slight difference in what central bankers will perceive to be their job, right? So they have these inflation targets, and the market mechanism is instrumentally valuable according to their account in hitting these inflation targets. Right? So there, I agree with you that there might be room, and this might be a good idea to maybe reorient some of the arguments in the paper in that way, to say, look, if you want to hit your inflation targets, right, you need to make sure that the underlying markets are actually working more efficiently than they are today. And if that is your goal, then you should be caring about these externalities. So on that one, I agree. But the second one, so you started off by saying, how do we conceptualize negative externalities? Are there potentially even some questions related to property rights that come into play here if we conceived of property rights differently? For instance, if we took into account justice questions, maybe then we would conceptualize negative externalities differently. I think that opens a whole other can of worms. And I think even if fundamentally you're right, the question is whether I want to open that kind of worms here. But maybe I misunderstood something on the second part.
So the first, you're absolutely right. The first part was just kind of strategic advice, grounded in what Carney says is like, oh, we're just trying to move markets to efficiency, right?
Yeah.
Well, then it seems that there's a good deal of dishonesty about the current situation, because it's I mean,
Feel that they're not efficient. Yeah.
it's not efficient. Why is it not efficient? Because of carbon, right?
Yeah.
Right. That's because the various people are absorbing those costs, right, and not being compensated for. But the second point is just, I guess, outside of the strategic thing, just whether the degree to which you, I mean, this doesn't affect what you should do with the argument, but I'm just curious intellectually, degree to which you think it adequately captures the problem of carbon emissions that we face and other environmental things, that they generate negative externalities as measured by the market.
Yeah, so I'll have to think about that that second one. I mean, the externalities are not if you take into account effects on health, life expectancy, clean air, and so on, it seems to me that they affect everyone equally, independently of where they sit, for instance, in the distribution of income and wealth, right? The question then becomes, well, does the market mechanism also value them equally, independently of where you sit in the distribution of income and wealth? Right? And there it might be the case that it doesn't. But I'll think about that one more.
Thanks, you too. Oliver and then Stan. So, like a good carpenter, I see nails everywhere. In my case, nails on governance. So I feel that your argument is kind of like it's an argument, it's a well thought out, it was a good argument around this particular ineffective aspect of governance that has sort of been born of history and context that may no longer be relevant in this kind of changing world. But I guess I worry when we start, I think our values align, so I'm not going to disagree with you that we have to reduce the carbon, in the atmosphere.
Yeah.
But the same arguments could be made for, I don't know, shoddy food, lending to fast food joints. There's all kinds of public risk plastics problem, right? The list could get long, right?
Yeah.
And so I think we certainly don't want a cabal of central bankers making a decision on the good and the naughty list, right? So that's already got to be out, right? And then we have to say, okay, if we're going to get to this governance problem, there's too much carbon because we're worried about temperature change. We agree that there's a whole bunch of mechanisms, and now we can have sort of two tracks of conversation. Don't worry, we get to the question. Two tracks of conversation.
There's already many questions, but yeah.
You know, two tracks because in our sort of, you know, democratic society, we can barely have what I call economics 101 conversations. You're talking, you know, beyond grad level analysis, right? Grad students go through economics degrees and don't understand how money is made. I agree with that premise. I don't think society is going to be ready to have this conversation that you're offering. So we're going to have a real governance conversation about how are we going to create this mechanism. My question to you would be, if you could fix the central bank role, how do you maintain its independence, which is important because we can get out of the 4-year cycle that politics does, but not make it a winner and loser chooser, because we're gonna have to link it to societal questions. So is it the mandate is wrong when we make central banks about inflation targets and carbon targets? Is that a way to kind of unpuzzle it? Because I'm not sure your premise that we can just educate people on the complexity of what you offer will ever work.
Thanks, Oliver. So there's tons there. Let's just divide it in two broad areas. But one is the scope of the argument question, and then what should we do in terms of institutional government. But I want to start with the scope of the argument question because I was surprised, but then again not surprised when I gave this as a webinar recently, and in Sweden, but then someone from Canada, from the East Coast, a real estate guy contacted me and said, this is what the Canadian government needs to do about housing. Too much money has gone into building mansions and more money needs to go into, so we need a credit policy, right? That says all these commercial banks shouldn't lend to this kind of project.
Yeah, and you do the list would be long.
The list would be long. But notice that in the post-war period, that's what we did, and we have credit policies. Yeah.
In France, they were.
Yeah, France. So when anyone brings examples of credit policies, it's always the French examples, right? So I think that's what so it's not as if we've never done this. It's not as if no one is doing this on the planet right now, right? And, you know, I would immediately agree, no, we shouldn't stop at fossil fuel stuff, but the fossil fuel stuff is the existential stuff that we need to sort out, otherwise it's going to go up, right? So that's why I'm focusing on that. So that's the scope of the argument question. So then the institutional question.
I just want to make sure we get that because I'm maybe not understanding. So you're saying, yes, we should intervene, we should start here and probably do a whole bunch more.
Well, so I already want to change that first sentence. Yes, we should. We already intervene.
Okay.
Right, but our intervention takes the form of unconditional delegation. That is an intervention. We're writing the commercial banks a blank check in terms of what they lend to. This is a privilege that they granted, and we're not imposing any conditions. That is an intervention. It's the wrong kind of intervention.
Is it an intervention or an absence of an intervention?
I want to call it an intervention in the same way as this is an intervention. They're both political all the way down. They're both decisions that should, you know, involve the democratic.
There are a series of other decisions that have yielded a result, which we agree. I don't think we disagree on the dislike of the result. I'm worried about how we characterize. I don't want to go too far down.
Okay, but let me get institutional governance, right? So here's two ways you could go about it. Right? One way is to say, okay, if we want to get back to these credit policies, right, we just can't, for democratic reasons, we can't do it with independent central banks. We need to go back to joint committees of central bankers and politicians, parliamentarians, right, that decide how this. So, for instance, if we do an asset purchase, the central bank might decide how many assets get purchased, but the parliamentary committee decides which assets get purchased. So then you have democratic input. So that's one way to do it. There's another side of me that thinks that our chances of addressing climate change through these democratic means are lower than giving control over environmental decisions to an independent agency. Now, I have qualms with that temptation that I feel, right? But I feel we would have more chances to actually address the issue if we told the central banks, no, it's your job to make sure that this stuff doesn't get financed.
So increasing their mandate.
So, yeah, and there are people who say, well, two objectives of the mandate is problematic, and there are people who say, well, this is problematic from the democratic perspective, and I get that, right? But I'm still torn between those two ways.
It's great to have a carpenter in the room. So we come to Stan now, but Rod, I've seen your hand, so you'll be
one of this.
yeah, but Stan first, maybe Rod and then Mac, so thanks for your patience, yeah. Stan.
Thanks for the presentation, and if you have a draft ready, I'll actually not read it. Yeah, it's really interesting stuff. So your argument is basically that we can't tackle climate change through like so-called green finance, something like this, because basically it's still profitable. There's no substitution effect. It's still profitable to lend to fossil fuels, and the reason for this is because there's this delegation of money creation between central banks, and central banks should stop doing this, right? So you kind of like cut the tap of funding to us fossil fuels, right? If I understood you correctly, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we could completely internalize externalities, in which case none of these commercial banks would be tempted to lend to.
Yeah.
Right? But it's kind of the second best argument, given that we're not doing that.
Yeah. Also, how do you do this? How various objections against taxing carbon and so on. So I have one worry about one thing about your policy proposals, and one kind of like more general question about your account of efficiency, which is actually yielding very much on what Colin said. So the first worry is, so first when you mentioned we need to definantialize, I started sweating, but then you started saying, okay, no, we're not going to do that. I was like,
I still think it would be a good idea, but
okay, I disagree. But then you said, yeah, okay, we need to kind of like change the mandate on the central bank. And so my worry is basically the same worry Soliver mentioned, like, are we not going to set a precedent, basically? Like, there are so many supposedly independent institutions that are being politicized these days. It's one of the greatest problems of today's politics. The American Supreme Court is the latest sole example, and the Polish Supreme Court is the same. Like, honestly, I share your concern about the cabal of central bankers, but I prefer cabals of central bankers than cabals of populist politicians elected by stupid voters, right? So, really, like, you just set the precedent.
Yes.
And I'm sorry, but this is the short we have today in most countries, not only the US or so like you're setting a precedent here, and I think, and then your answer is, well, but the central bank is already, and this is already my objection. Yeah, they're already politicized, right? Because they are doing this, and this is what I think. I could nitpick with your account of efficiency, right? So why is carbon still profitable? Well, most consumers have a preference for carbon, right? That's the main thing. Most people keep buying, keep purchasing for the purchasing pattern. They keep expressing a preference for carbon. And if you drop here, you're getting points, by the way. You're right. So they keep expressing a preference for carbon, right? And so you can argue, well, but this creates an externality that they don't fully realize, and so the cost-benefit analysis. I'm really not sure about this. So it's kind of like a common way of understanding climate change. This is cost-benefit analysis, and carbon has more costs than it has benefits. I think it's not as clear-cut as most people believe. I'm very much concerned about climate change, by the way. I'm not kind of like saying anything here, which is, I think it's not as clear-cut as most people think. I think the welfare effect of carbon is still very much in the positive, especially in developing economies. And and so if you think that efficiency is just preference satisfaction, right? Then you can say, well, you can say to central bankers, you cannot like politicizing your mandate because it should just strive towards efficiency, preference satisfaction. And then they're going to say, well, we just lend money to private banks. And then you say to private banks, well, you guys are kind of like promoting carbon. This is not something that you should be doing. And they said, people want carbon. People express preference. They are purchasing carbon, and they are like, for their consumer purchasing patterns, for their purchasing pattern, consumer's choice. They are using carbon. They're just satisfying preferences here. And so this is where I'm getting at. Sorry, it's a bit of a monologue. So I'm getting at. So you cannot represent your argument as the reason we should reform central bank policies.
Hmm.
I read your argument. The implication I get from your argument is that basically we are not going to make the transition out of carbon through basically tinkering with finance incentives and stuff like this. This is something that the state should do. And this is what I'm getting at. It was a pro-nuclear argument all along, right? Where's nuclear in this account, right? So one of the most efficient and cost benefits, positive way in terms of cost benefit analysis to decarbonize the economy is to go nuclear, right? And the private sector is not going to do this. This is what the state should do. And so on a wide reflected equilibrium, I'm wondering how plausible your argument is, right? Because basically, okay, you want to change central bank stuff, this can set precedent, this can be costly, and so on. And we have much better solutions that don't require us to kind of tinker with the financial system overall. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, so three things. Right?
Yeah.
One, I'm going to resist the temptation to get dragged into the debate about nuclear. I don't think I need to. So my worry here is about turning off the tap to fossil fuel financing, right? What we do, on the other hand, in terms of promoting which other source of energy is another discussion that we need to have, and I want to remain open to that. So the second point, and I think there we might have a real disagreement, is the one about consumer preferences, right? Because you say, look, people are expressing a preference to still consume carbon. Well, they are doing so at the wrong prices. So, I would say, what is the right price for carbon right now? I think $230 a ton or something, and we're at $50 a ton. So see how many people would still drive to work then. Okay, and then we're talking.
Yeah,
right?
Sure.
And one of the reasons why it's still so cheap, given that we're not internalizing the externalities, is that we're tolerating and even promoting a system that still pumps money into the production of fossil fuels. So I think that's where I say, sure, this is an expressed preferences, but the preference is the preference is expressed in the wrong context. And then I think the very beginning of your question came back to the stuff I already discussed with all of us, but we can come back to it. But maybe I'll leave it at that for now.
Thanks. Rod, do you want to unmute? Wonderful you could join us. Although I see Jennifer, great to see you. Could you, Rod?
Well, thank you very much. Thanks, Peter. As usual, you've completely changed the scope of the discourse from what I was expecting. I do want to just comment, if I may, that I thought Colin's observation that when we're talking about externalities, the basic issue is a fundamentally unjust system of property rights, and we really need to get at the distribution of property rights if we're going to deal with the inefficiencies in the market mechanisms in any fundamental way. But I wanted to go back to I guess it's Economics 301 from an earlier era, and that was, my understanding was that the independent central bank was created in order to deal with problems of price instability as a result of the operations of an unregulated system of private banks. And there was a feeling in the mid-30s that we needed, in Canada at least, we needed an independent influence. We needed some public control or regulation of, but a non-political public regulation of these financial transactions. So the central bank was set up. It had really very limited instruments. It controls an overnight lending rate, and it has the power to buy and sell securities, but very limited instruments. And it had a task of trying to regulate prices to avoid the problem of inflation. And that was its goal, was to have inflation. And it has an inflation target now. There have been various discussions around that question, but it does have an inflation target. And its task, its singular task, is to try to use the instruments at its disposal to maintain inflation within a target range, and ideally at 2%, 1 to 3%, ideally at 2. There's the big controversies that I've seen about the role of the central bank is how much should it be involved with the trade-off between unemployment and inflation. So if you think that there is a trade-off there, some people argue that the central bank has the task of balancing monetary policy so as to find the right balance between inflation and unemployment. But as I understand the way the debate's evolved, things have settled more in the direction, the monetarist direction, of saying that the task is to use the overnight lending rate and its associated instruments to regulate inflation. Quantitative easing, well, we can get into that a little bit for purposes of regulating employment and encouraging employment, reducing unemployment. But those are the roles for the central bank, and it's intended to be independent from political influence, from political preferences, precisely because this is a very challenging technical problem in itself. So it seems to me that traditional argument would say we certainly do have a problem of dealing with climate change, but the central bank is in no way the instrument to be brought into that fray.
Yeah, so I hear what you're saying. This, I think, is a common argument also in the central banking community. I would maybe say that central banks were set up in order to regulate the commercial banks, but then the whole independence argument only really took off in the 1980s, 1990s, right? That's when, after so one of the examples that is often given is the Nixon government in the United States, who really tried to manipulate interest rates for electoral purposes, and so that's kind of one of the foundational myths of the independent central bank that has since swept the world. Right? So the way I would frame the argument, I think this is an important argument, but it has to be weighed against the costs that are associated with this particular institutional setup. And the costs can be described in terms of the unintended consequences that this institutional setup has for income and wealth inequality, for the environment, for other purposes. And so monetary economists often try to present the issue as one that says, well, price stability creates the foundation for all these other things to be able to happen, to occur. I would see them as more straightforward trade-offs in line with the trade-off that you mentioned between employment and inflation. There are trade-offs here. There are trade-offs between price stability and environmental policy. There are trade-offs between price stability and income and wealth inequality. And I think we have to address these trade-offs institutionally. So maybe the institutional framework that was fit for an era where the climate change weren't as pressing, and also where the instruments of the central banks were much more limited, maybe that institutional framework, I would argue, is no longer fit for our context today. Right? So that's the debate, right?
It is, I suppose, if you're getting into instrument choice, you could argue that outside the central bank, the instruments for dealing with the climate change are much more powerful if you look to regulation, if you were to eliminate the fiscal subsidies to fossil fuel activity, if you were to look for the the possibility of a cap as is being proposed on emissions. There are a lot of instruments which can deal directly with the challenge of climate change and the externalities involved in the unduly low price of carbon. You can get the price of carbon up where it should be. Those are not instruments in the hands of the central bank, but they could be deployed a great deal more effectively.
I agree. So in a way, the point of my argument is to show that, you know, our support for our institutional and public support for fossil fuels goes even further than the subsidies and any fiscal measures that we regularly talk about. It also extends to the financial arrangements of the economy. But I agree with you. It's then another question of how we should react to that diagnosis, so that we can maybe separate the diagnosis and the treatment.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you. Wonderful hearing from you. I think we're getting closer to the end, but Max, you know, you're definitely last but not least.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter, for a very fascinating research. So, in our view, in terms of management and organization, we should usually call what you're doing kind of sustainable finance. I don't know whether the term resonates with you.
Yeah, well, I mean, that goes back to the beginning of the presentation, right? There's a lot of effort these days to promote sustainable finance. My worry is that given our institutional framework, there's no link between sustainable finance and emissions going down.
Yeah, that's why they try to fix it.
It's that, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay. Yeah, I have two questions. First, regarding one of the two implications about specifically about the reserve requirements.
Yeah.
In my understanding, and as far as I'm concerned, it has been there. Right. I mean, that requirement has been there, and it has been functioning in just, you know, normal banks. And the case of Silicon Valley is very typical in because the reserve requirement is not met. Do I understand correctly? So it means that I question whether that implication or suggestion actually works. And then my second question is, it seems to me that the discussion about financing, banking, are trying to move from efficiency to effectiveness. And my question is whether, do we also think about the implications or your suggestions in terms of the configuration, any specific configuration of different suggestions to make it really work?
Not sure. The second one we might have to discuss, but
Yeah.
not really after. But so the first one about the reserve requirements.
Yeah.
So I mean, there's two things to say here. One is that, especially since the financial crisis, but even before, reserve requirements were more and more relaxed. So they are not an active policy tool today. And you know, the Silicon Valley Bank earlier this year, I think, is one of those cases where you could say, well, if we'd had more stringent reserve requirements, then something like this wouldn't have happened. Right? But I mean, more generally to your question, are these effective as a tool? They're a buffer, right? So when you think of them from a financial stability perspective, they're a buffer. If a bank takes huge risks, even the buffer might not be.
Yeah.
But from an environmental perspective, it would just mean that there is going to be less leeway for lending. We're going to hit a limit. The commercial bank is going to hit a limit at some point when it has to stop lending. And then we would hope that some of the fossil fuel projects fall off the cliff at that point.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just have a brief comment because we're talking about the independency of the central bank, and we all know that independency is driven by certain interests. So those are all human beings that have a certain agenda. So I question this, you know, if it's possible to have an independent system. So I'm looking very much forward to your second approach on what you were announcing at the beginning, that we're might you plan a second paper on institutional reforms and systems, how to regulate such a situation? Because I think we're kind of talking always about something that due to human, interest, there are always interests in those decision making.
But there are some political scientists who are very cynical about the whole concept of the independent central bank. Right? They say, well, it was basically a maneuver to create an entity that can make unpopular decisions without getting sacked at the ballot box.
Exactly, there might be interest in that.
That's why it's also.
Yeah, so and there is something to that. Right? Again, it's this double-edged sword, right? Do we want direct democratic control over these decisions, right? Or on the other hand, do we want to isolate certain decisions from direct democratic control? Because, and this is precisely the argument in the monetary economics literature, right? Because monetary policy as a tool to achieve price stability will be more effective if it's isolated from democratic control. So I think you could make a similar argument, again, I'm tempted that I'm always torn, you could make a similar argument and say an independent central bank will be more effective in helping to achieve our climate targets if we give them the right instructions.
And with the right person in.
Well, yeah, so, but that's maybe another dimension, right? But it'll be more effective. The effectiveness question. But then, of course, we can come and say, but what about the democracy question?
You need to kill the pro-democrat in you, I think.
No, I'm not ready for that yet. And I'm just saying, I didn't say this in this paper. I think there's a trade-off.
Peter, it's very hard to bring your session to close. How's that? Not very good.
Briefly, probably naive question, but even hypothetically, assuming that the central bank could be regulated according to the options that you've presented, would it be really possible, considering how the fossil fuel is an issue that it's global and everybody's financial interests are connected in some way? Would it be possible to regulate just one central bank and then expect that this could solve the problem just on a national basis, or is it even conceivable?
So here's the argument for no. Central banking has evolved into this very homogeneous outlook. So to an extent that, for instance, after the Iron Curtain came down, there were a lot of, the central banks in Eastern Europe were set up through advice from central banks in the West in no time. Right? They were gave them a few months. They meet up in Basel a few times, and boom, it's there. Right? The central bank independence template had been applied and basically applied across these countries, right? And it's widely applied in many places. And of course, it's difficult to, as a single country, if you're not the United States or the Eurozone, maybe to some extent, to go your own way and stray away from that template. But then again, we do have examples where things work differently, right? So in Asia, there's many central banks that regularly talk to government, and sustainability issues are on their agenda. And you also have now the Brits and the Europeans doing this tilting of future quantitative easing. It's not a huge change, but it's a change, right? So to some extent, it is about shifting the debate, and to some extent, it's about who's on the committee, right? So Sarah Bloom Raskin in the United States was debated as a potential nominee for was it on? Yeah, I think it was to succeed, to basically take Powell's position, and he was nominated, and we would have a different Federal Reserve if she'd been nominated. So I think there is a very strong template that is being applied everywhere, but there might be some room for maneuver for change.
Thank you, Peter. Yeah, fascinating, but also sobering to see, lots of hopes on the financial sector to be a driver of change, but the way you describe it now seems very limited the impact, but rather it's, I think we had the news was half a year ago that Canadian banks are right on top in terms of fossil fuel subsidies, right, and lending practices and so forth, and so and you wonder, or how much is
again, we can make a difference,
Yeah.
Go join Van City.
Yeah.
You take from it now. Sorry.
It's not a solution, basically that this is wrong.
No, that's not wrong, but
Well, I
it's
mean,
limited in
very,
terms of scope.
very
Let's invite Mark Carney here to give a sense of